everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on virtual nursing. Virtual nursing is both new and here to stay. My name is Kat Costa. I'm a nurse here at eVisit, where I lead our product segment efforts, and I am very excited to bring this panel discussion to you in partnership with Equum Medical. We've got a very lively panel to share this conversation with. I'd like to introduce Linda Lockwood, Sarah Bell, and Kristen Lawton. And ladies, would you please give the audience a brief introduction?
Sure. Thank you, Kat. My name's Linda Lockwood. I'm a nurse by background, joining my colleagues, all nurses, 30 plus years of experience. I started in the ED and critical care, nursing leadership, and I've spent the past 20 years actually working with hospital systems, nurses and doctors to understand how we can improve processes in care through the use of digital and value measurement. I've been working with virtual nursing for the past 3 to 4 years, and I'm really excited to join this panel as we look at what's happening nationally. Sarah.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Kat. Hey, everyone. Sarah Bell. I'm also a nurse. I spent over 18 years of my career at Mayo Clinic and getting my first taste of virtual care in 2013 when we started EICU. And as the pandemic, started, virtual nursing became the thing, and being able to start that and evolve that practice at Mayo was amazing. And now I'm currently looking into the future in Gen AI and serving as Chief Clinical Officer for a Gen AI startup. Happy to be here. Kristen?
Hi, thanks so much. Kristen Lawton, Chief Nursing Officer at Equum Medical. My nursing journey started in the emergency department as well as a nurse, and then I went into nursing leadership. This year, I joined Equum Medical as Chief Nursing after leaving as a nurse executive of a health system. And this opportunity has really afforded me to look at how we can redefine our nursing care models by leveraging technology and innovation. So I'm really excited to be part of this robust panel to have some interesting discussions. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, ladies. That's perfect. All right, let's get to it. We did structure the conversation so that we had some structure. Please feel free to put comments or questions in the chat. We do want this to be a dialogue. We want you to get the most out of this. A little disclosure, we practiced, and this is our structure, but this is a high energy group. I cannot promise that we'll stick to it. In fact, I hope we deviate a little bit, and I hope we get into some really meaningful discussion and ask some of those hard questions. So please be open-minded. We may go off the script a little bit, but I think that'll be part of the fun. So let's get to it with building the foundation. So, health IT, it's not easy being a clinician in a health IT company, but you got to have us, right? We need to be present and have that clinical voice at the table. So how do we know it's time for virtual nursing? What are the pillars, the signs, the symptoms within an organization that says, we're ready, it's something we can benefit from, it's going to be of value, and it will help? Kristen, did you have any experience or thoughts on that?
Sure. Thanks so much. When you say the symptoms, I think of so often in our careers, we're diagnosing patients, but now our nursing workforce has been we've been diagnosing them, right? So what is the problem? What are we looking at? When I work with organizations, I often find that, they're looking at the burnout, nurses leaving the bedside. Why are they leaving the bedside? What does that look like? Staffing challenges, ratios. You hear the buzz term administrative burden. What does that look like? So often EHRs, there's another task, there's another click, and so much time is being spent at the bedside with all of that it's taking them away from any of those quality specific measures they need to do, or just from taking care of those patients. So often we're being brought in at that time to say, what does it look like, and what do we need to help you solve for?
Yeah, isn't it ironic that some of the burden, most of the burdens, are really a byproduct of the technology that we've been introducing into the health systems over the last couple decades? We're finally at the tipping point where technology can be a bit of a pressure valve release, allow some of that burden to be alleviated. I think the trick, though, before we start any of these programs, is really getting executive buy-in, really convincing that the value is there. How do we get our C-suite on board with what we know and we feel at the bedside? Linda, did you have any guidance on how to help manage that?
Sure. I'd like to share that. That's a question that I'm sure all of you are being asked every day. I know I'm hearing it all the time. Virtual nursing, it's so exciting, and we're all brimming with passion here to share with you. But we've been doing this for since the pandemic. And so, you know, our C-suite's asking, particularly finance, where's the value? Where's the ROI in this? And I want to go back to the beginning, because as I've worked with members, as I'm sure my colleagues have, you need to build a solid foundation, and finance needs to be at the table when that happens. And this doesn't have to be a big deal, but if you're able to bring together an interdisciplinary team, when you start to think about virtual nursing and help that team come together, and it doesn't have to be a big deal, it can be a day-long session with an hour spent on visioning, and ask 4 simple questions. What is our goal with virtual nursing? What is the problem we're trying to solve? What is it going to feel like for our nurses? What is it going to feel like for our patients? And what is the impact we're going to make? And if finance is at the table when we're starting to talk about that impact, people are becoming bought in. They understand what the program is. Quite often what I see is finance suddenly sees it on the balance sheet and says, what about these virtual nurses? Like, are we really getting value from this? So the first step is getting buy-in. The second is really around culture. And you might think that's funny, but it's really not. What I see when I work with organizations is when the senior leadership says, this is a way we're delivering care. This isn't a little pilot that we're doing. This is really our new care delivery system, and the virtual nurse is going to be a piece of that. The second thing I think is important with the business case is that we're really clear in the beginning on what we're measuring. Those KPIs have to link really closely with the problem we're trying to solve, and everybody has to buy in. And quite often that doesn't happen. And we'll talk about KPIs a little later. And then I think the third thing, and I know my colleagues would all agree, and I'll invite them to speak about this, is that you're not going to get the value from virtual nursing with 1 or 2 pilots. And so if you're limping along, and we'll talk about scale, and Sarah's got a lot of experience there, but you're not able to really scale this and transform the way you deliver care and really change your care model, you probably aren't going to get that value. So 3 simple things: involve leadership from the beginning, including finance, be clear on the problem you're trying to solve, and understand it's not going to happen immediately. Anybody else? Sarah, Kristen, want to
No,
layer in?
agree. I think one other key piece there, Linda, and you talked about getting the CFO and finance involved. And I think it's really important to understand the finances, but to also understand that outcomes aren't immediately available. So we've been caring for patients in the way we do without virtual care for decades, forever. And so to just come in and add virtual care as a practice, it takes change, takes evolution. The evidence will come. So just encouraging our colleagues in the C-suite to be patient. And to Linda's point, it's not a pilot anymore. It's an implementation. It's the new way to practice. It's an important way to practice. And so being sure that your C-suite can sit in that.
That's amazing. So are you suggesting that do we steer away from pilots? Do we say like early implementation? I mean, are there pros and cons to having something called a pilot versus phase 1 implementation?
I think one thing that I just wanted to share quick before you dive into that, Kristen, is in stats and statistics. So EICU started early 2000s because there was an intensivist shortage, and we knew patients got better care in the ICU if an intensivist was involved in their care. And now we're facing really a crisis of nursing workforce. Just some statistics to center ourselves in: 800,000 nurses intend to leave the bedside by 2027. Nurse to patient ratios tripled in 2022. And we're looking at a 13 million RN shortage globally by 2030. So all of the reasons that EICU and telemedicine started in the early 2000s are here for nurses. And we should really take call to that and make an action plan. And so, Kristen, your thoughts on, just jump in. Like, what do we do?
You know, I think that question about pilot is very interesting. I think what you've said and what we've shared, that virtual nursing is successful, and that organizations are really, they're committed when they're going on this journey. So it's not necessarily a pilot. It's like, what unit are we going to start on? How are we going to look at this implementation? And then how can we move it on to the other units and scale that to the rest of the hospital? And when you think about success, you know, you think of the trifecta of technology, the people, and the process. I think that the technology has to seamlessly fit into the nurse's day-to-day work, right? I remember being a nurse and somebody coming to me and me rolling my eyes and saying, oh, here we go. But, you know, it's got to work into my day for me to be able to use it and to see its value. When you think about process, I think we've been very successful, and I see successful organizations that nurses and maybe other disciplines should be part of the process from the beginning. You know, Linda really shared, what are we solving for? What is the why that we're doing this? And if you can start that journey all together where you hear the same message and you have that, you know, your C-suite and all of you from a kickoff call to that entire journey, why are we doing this? What does this look like? Getting to know each other, whether it's a decentralized or centralized model that you'll be looking at. And I know we're going to talk about that later. All of you getting to know and working towards that final goal, that really makes a successful pilot. And the tech doesn't have to sometimes be extravagant. Sometimes I've seen an iPad on a stick. I've seen, integrated into the systems, into the bedside cameras and the TVs. I've seen that successful, but just going towards that goal. And the people, like I said before, I think the people all going to that common goal and getting to know each other really makes for a successful pilot. Using that shared governance approach, using those meetings, saying, hey, this is the person on the other side of the camera. And also maybe sometimes finding from your patients as well. People have patient advisory councils, or they might have some really strong patients that come into their workflows every day, having them have a voice as well and what that looks like to spread the good word.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. I'm going to stop for a moment because we're really, I think, establishing that foundation that we want folks to get their brains wrapped around. Any questions, folks? Don't be shy. Q&A, the chat, whatever, anything anyone wants to add to that as we move on a little bit more into the growth and value of a virtual nursing program. It's a shy group. We'll get a question in there at some point. Want to double click on your comment about people, Kristen, and the dichotomy is the best way I can think to describe it, between meeting the needs of the remote clinician and the bedside clinician, really, and bringing that together. I think we've seen that at the end of the day, the technology that we're bringing forward, yes, it's going to make the care delivery or care enablement better. But is there a healthy tension between the remote clinician and the bedside clinician that you've experienced or that you would help coach us through to be prepared for?
That's an interesting way to say that. A healthy tension. I like that. I haven't seen I guess I have seen a healthy tension, right? Holding each other accountable, making sure that we're, having that follow-up, sharing really great wins to understand what we're looking from each side. I look to see Sarah and Linda, if you have any history with that too. I think those are very important to make sure that we stay with the same common goal.
Yeah, I think it has to be immediately useful to the bedside team, and you can grow from there. So taking on tasks right away that are of burden to the bedside nursing team and to the care teams that can count for easy wins, to Kristen's point, you need the ball to start rolling downhill and get people to understand the value. And let's be honest, everybody's too busy today to sit through an education session about how to do something as a bedside nurse and read PowerPoints and look at, trainings. They want to show up on day one and the virtual nurse comes on, adds immediate value, and they're like, oh, okay, I see how this could work. And you're going to slowly over time kind of build those champions. I think the other key piece is making sure that those who are on the unit that you're implementing on might also have some shifts in virtual care so that there's that trust built right away. We did that early on when we started virtual nursing. We had expert nurses from the units we were covering also work in virtual care. People can attach to, oh, I know Linda. She is a nurse on my unit. I understand her skill set. I trust that, and able to build that trust. That's not important long term, but it really is an important piece early on. And I think there's models out there today, and Linda, I'll let you speak to some of the evolving models that can speak to quick wins, but can also speak to maybe long-term success.
Yeah, I think we're going to talk about some of those a little later, but I want to tell a little story, and I want to key in on something that I think is really important here. And it goes back to that foundation, bringing that team together in the beginning. One of the easy things that I've done is when we have that day when we're bringing everybody together, start off with a walkthrough on the unit where you're going to start. Have the virtual nurse and the bedside nurse talk about where do we have problems? Where do we have redundant tasks? Where can we bring this, the virtual nurse in, and having them build the workflow and the scripts together, and building into and we learned this in EICU, right? Building into the process, regular meetings, problem solving, saying, hey, what did we learn on our last shift? How are we going to change what we're doing and do that quickly? I'm going to tell a really quick EICU story that I think is really relevant. And this is sort of a sad story. It was a case of an EICU nurse linking into the patient room, hearing a problem, and the bedside nurse, who was a traveler, not even knowing that there was a virtual nurse, and saying, who are you, to the patient. And so I think that's an extreme, but I think it really leads back to this story that we need to build that understanding and that trust up front. And we need to have everybody sort of involved in setting the foundation. And it's a continuous process. You know, I think we sometimes start something and forget that we've got to keep meeting together and changing. And Kristen, you probably do a lot of that. Both of you all have, when you implemented programs and took them to scale.
Absolutely. And I think also it's framing it that we're an extension of the team, right? So, you know, we're following, you know, we're coming together. We're an extension of that team, from whatever your models are, or from behaviors to, you know, talking about patient experience. And I think framing it that way from a leadership perspective, also not thinking we're replacing anybody or that we're replacing the nurse at the bedside. We just want to enhance the experience both for the patient and the nurses to be successful.
That's a great point. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to mention, Kat, there's a question in the Q&A that I think dovetails into what we're talking about. And it's about having the right virtual care staff. You need the right team in virtual care to do it. I just want to be bold and say virtual care is a specialty, and we need to understand that just because you're a nurse does not mean that you should or can be working in virtual care. There are interactions that take place virtually that are not the same as in person. And you have to go over and above and beyond to have that welcoming presence to allow people to lean on you, to leverage. So it's just some key skills that I've found to be really good traits for people. And it's shocker, it's not about age. It's not about, you know, our older nurses can't be virtual care nurses. That's not true. It's really about your leaders on the unit, your charge nurses, your preceptors, people who lead things. In virtual care, you have to be an independent, sometimes person that finds work. Work doesn't always come to you. And so having that independence and that ability to go out of their way to be helpful, I think communication is key. They have to be a really good communicator and somebody who is going to go above and beyond to connect with people and to reach out to them and to have that open kind of viewpoint. And then I think the other piece is when people don't know you, sometimes things that you say on camera don't come off the same way if you're in person. And so there's a lot of times feedback that we have to give to our virtual care team members. And that's okay. That's a part of the job. So you want people that are willing and able to receive that feedback and move on and kind of implement it in their next practice. I don't know, Kristen, do you have other things that you want to share on that?
Yeah, it's almost like you have an on stage, off stage, right? Once that camera's on. That's interesting that you said that. I like that. The other piece of it too that I've found working with different health system is that mentorship, right? The nurse that's in that role to those younger nurses that are being like, they might have a question. I heard a story recently with one of my clients that this young nurse said, I really like to call the virtual nurse because I don't want the other nurses to think I don't know what I'm doing. And I just like thought about that for a second. And I didn't even think of that impact that virtual nursing could have for that nurse to be successful. Now, mind you, we were talking about culture and sometimes that's what we're solving for. And then I've also, been able to work with other organizations and, nursing education. Virtual nursing is not replacing the dynamic nursing education at the hospitals. We're just working alongside education and helping those nurses ask those questions or figuring out how we can get that nurse to the next stop. So Tara, I loved what you said. And I just wanted to add that piece too, because that's what I found recently.
That's fantastic. That's perfect. That's perfect. And thank you for picking up that question, Sarah, in the chat. We talked a lot about the person, the people aspect of virtual nursing. Zane has a question in the chat about the technology. How much is too much, right? There's some feedback in here that there's so much technology. It's hard to manage. What's experience on that? I mean, how do you have experience?
There's loads of technology, and I think it's how it's used. You walk into a health system today and you have a camera system for video, telesitting. You have likely a camera system on the wall. You might have iPads for translators and other things. I just think that's the state that we're in today. I don't think adding another device or leveraging an existing device for virtual nursing is the wrong answer. I think you should do virtual nursing. And so thinking about, what's your ability to control all of the contracts and things that your health system has? I don't think you're going to be able to control that. But can I leverage an existing device for virtual nursing to make that more seamless? I think that's more of the question that you could do. I do think from a technology standpoint, the boom from COVID, name your video, name your AI, your sitting. There's loads of options out there. And so starting with virtual nursing, and it can be used on any of those. So don't let the right piece of technology be a barrier for you. That's my advice.
I think it's also a balance too. Like if you're using virtual nursing and your bedside nurse, like when you're on your implementation, how often is the virtual nurse going to round versus the versus the bedside nurse? I've seen, sometimes we're all rounding at the same time and the patient's like, whoa, there's so many people coming at me. I mean, that's a fun thing to have to establish early on. I had a patient, I was doing a patient callback once, and I called and spoke to a patient, and he said, he's like, I wasn't sure about this virtual nurse piece, but the nurse, I felt like I could really talk to her, and I'm not that difficult. So my nurse got to really take care of her other patients. It was a really nice perception from a patient experience that I was able to give back to the client as well, to say, look at that. Look at these different care models that we're doing to help those patients. So I just wanted to share a little bit about that feedback as well.
That's perfect. That's perfect. And Zane, I see your question in there about AI, and we will surely get to that as well. Let's keep moving. Let's talk about KPIs, because there's so much more we could talk about this. There's a lot of hardware debate. I think what I'm hearing as takeaways: don't let it be a barrier. Be as hardware agnostic as you can be. Do virtual nursing, right? Just don't let it be a barrier. Let's talk about KPIs, and I'm going to lean on you a little bit here, Linda. We have to be able to measure value. We heard the message already. Don't rush it. It takes time. But you want to talk a little bit more about specific KPIs around virtual nursing that we should be planning for and maybe benchmarking?
Sure. I want to start off again with, and I know I've talked a lot about the foundation, but there's a couple of key pieces with KPIs, and then we'll get into a lot of the ones that we're seeing. And I'd love to hear what Sarah and Kristen have to say. I think the first rule, and I know I already talked about this, is to be really clear on what we're measuring. What is the problem we're trying to solve? And I'll give you an example. So we've talked a lot about taking stress off the bedside nurse. And so if that is our goal and the problem we're trying to solve, then we want to really start to measure things like how much time is the bedside nurse spending in the EHR. So linking it to the problem we're trying to solve, and getting a really good set up front of process measures. Our process measures are going to be our North Star when we're looking to see what's happening with implementation. Are we really improving the time it takes to do an admission and discharge? How many admissions and discharges or virtual nursing touches are we able to do? And how are we impacting both the patients and the bedside nurses? Keep those metrics simple. If we have 20, 30 things to measure, we're never going to be able to hone in on our KPIs. So again, keeping them simple and coming from a measurement standpoint, and I think probably Sarah can relate to this too with AI, we want to be really clear on our data definitions. Whenever we can take a metric that we already have and use that, and we have common definitions, that's important too. But I think key is setting baseline measures. I can't tell you how many times we work with a client and they say, oh yeah, well, we knew we were going to impact retention and, HCAHPS and those kinds of things, but we don't really know if we've made a difference because we didn't take a baseline measure. And so I want to make sure people understand that baseline measures aren't hard. So if we understand upfront what the KPIs are and everybody sort of agrees to them, then we need to say, okay, where do we stand today? And it can be as simple as doing a little time study with an N of 30, right? Hopefully you can see from your EHR how much time is spent, but really looking at what are those tasks today? How long do they take? The other piece that has to do with baseline measures is we're going to get a lot of pushback on measures like length of stay and readmissions, because there are a lot of people who can impact those measures. But what I've seen folks do successfully is say, we're going to measure that from the beginning on this unit where we started virtual nursing in these use cases, and we're going to measure it afterwards at 3 months, at 6 months. And then they could say, you know, on those units where we're not doing virtual nursing, we're here. Here's the units where we are doing virtual nursing and starting to say that we're making a difference. But really making sure that you take those baseline measures in the beginning is important. The other thing is, what's your measurement strategy? Who's going to own that? You need to be best friends with your nursing informaticists and your analysts, and you guys need to agree on what those measures are. Do those reports, get them out there, get the feedback, and drive the change. And then remember, those outcomes won't come right away. So what are some of those measures? We see measures around nursing retention. I think Kristen talked a lot about the supporting staff through doing virtual mentoring. That is absolutely key. We know that there's an experience complexity gap out there. So can we keep those new nurses? I've had, you know, hospitals tell me they have new nurses leave within 6 months. We know that's a costly experience. Looking at overtime spend, you know, are we impacting that time for that nurse spending in the EHR? I know a lot of people aren't using agency staff anymore. You've got your own internal staff, but are you decreasing that labor spend because we're able to now shift some of those tasks to the virtual nurse? Certainly patient experience. We've got a lot of case studies that show us that HCAHPS, patient communication, understanding your medications and your discharge. And we know that there's a financial value equated with that, particularly if you've got value-based care contracts. I talked about readmission and length of stay. We're going to talk about use cases in a minute. But when you are implementing surveillance, when you are looking at those patients that might have a deterioration index or sepsis, you're going to decrease mortality. You're going to decrease your codes, you're going to have a quicker time to rapid response, and decrease ICU length of stay. Sarah, Kristen, do you guys want to talk about some of the things you're seeing in measurement?
Yeah, when we started virtual nursing at Mayo, I have a paper out there about this. We looked at 1 year post results. We compared our first year results, comparing units supported by virtual nursing with units who did not have virtual nursing. And what we found is no difference in care, which is a huge win. We did not have any detriment in how patients were cared for. We did not have any misses. We actually had fewer errors because virtual nurses were looking around. And I think the biggest win for us was the fact that staff felt supported and were very highly satisfied with it. And then also doing measures with patient experience and interviewing patients. Patients were able to get out earlier. You have the virtual nurse doing the discharge at 8 a.m. while the nurse on the floor is, you know, giving and paying attention to other patients. Now, those types of, you know, discharge by noon metrics and other things going on take time to impact, but laying that foundation early on is huge. I like to caution against the conversation of, can I downsize my in-person nursing staff by adding virtual nurses? We already don't have enough in-person nurses. So I don't even know that that's necessarily a conversation. And I think certainly as we add in other tools like AI, we could get to a conversation point about how to change some of the staffing mix. But I don't know that early on you're going to say, okay, we're adding a virtual nurse, so we're taking 3 nurses away from how you staff your unit today. That's not a recipe for success.
Sarah, I love that you said that. I totally agree with that. And, you know, I think you've all have with these KPIs, we've had some really robust discussions. I think not having too many on the outset, that's really difficult. Making sure that you're focused and you have maybe, you know, just a few to focus on. If you're looking at HCAHPS, pick a couple of domains versus like the whole entire, you know, what the big piece of nurse communication. Well, what does that look like? From a discharge perspective, I've always felt in my career that discharge is probably one of the most important things that we need to focus on in a patient journey. And yet we're rushed, that we need to get the next patient into the bedside and the nurse has something else going on. So allowing that virtual nurse to really spend the time with discharges on day one, right? We're talking about discharge of, what's going to happen when you go home. I think that really will help that metric. The other piece I just wanted to talk about is nurse satisfaction. I really like to, when we have our interactions with virtual nurses, we close our interactions with a really quick 4-question survey just to say, how's it going? How is the technology? How would you improve this? Because if you don't have that answer and you're not solving for that every time, when you talked about change and change management, it's not going to happen as quickly or effectively as you think. So I think those are really important things to measure as well. And it doesn't have to be a 20-question survey, just a quick 3-question pulse survey. How's it going? And then get that feedback back to those nurses at the bedside to say, we heard you, and this is what we're going to change together.
Yeah, Kristen, I love that. I think that's really important. I think, keeping things simple, it's not a big deal. You don't have to do a major satisfaction survey. And let's do the same thing with our patients when they're discharged. Let's ask them 3 simple questions. I think that's awesome. Thank you, guys.
This was amazing. I want to ask one last question in this section about the growth and the value. So all great examples, all very real examples. I almost hate to ask this because it sounds sort of silly. But say we're there, we've done this, we've got all these great results in the unit that we've done the first implementation in. What are the key attributes, next steps to scale? I know scale is kind of an icky word, but where do you start? Do you do 1 unit at a time? And then when that's a success, 3 units, 4 units? Is it one hospital? I mean, what are your thoughts on how to really think through tactically the next steps in scale?
Yeah, I think a staged implementation is important for a number of reasons. When you start anything new, you're going to have problems. There's going to be issues that come up and you want to be able to quickly address them and move on. So one important thing to know is the virtual nursing program you start on day 1 will change up by day 2, will change by day 3, will change by day 4. And that's an important piece to consider. You need that evolution, you need that change, you need quick change. You don't want your practice to sit in something that's inefficient or doesn't make sense or is causing a lot of frustration with the bedside team. I also think that the surgical units are often a little bit easier to start on. They have more patient churn. And in terms from a KPI perspective, I think the admission, discharge, and speed to which those are happening is an easy metric to show your surgeons, hey, you can do more surgeries because we're getting patients out faster. And we all know that when your surgeons are happy, your margins are happy. So just if you had to pick a unit, I would say a surgical unit is sometimes a more robust cookie cutter type experience to go with. And then when we expanded, we actually did a medical and a surgical unit at the same time and went out that way. You don't want to forget your medical units. It's hard to be a medical nurse. It's hard those patients are complex. They need as much support. And so we would pair the 2 together. From a experience perspective, when you're implementing virtual nursing, I think it's important also to look at what other areas of your practice are using virtual nurses, EICU, telephonic nurse practices, remote patient monitoring, hospital at home, and how do you almost go about building a virtual hospital or service line? So let's just say, for example, we would have a patient who's not well on a general medical unit. We would call our EICU colleagues and they could video into the room and do a virtual rapid response. Virtual care allows you to bring care to the patient in an efficient way without deploying a whole bunch of physical bodies to get there. And so we would also leverage them in post-acute RPM. You have a patient who's at home. Do they come to the ER? Do they not? Are they a direct admit? And so deploying quote unquote service virtually, if you line up your virtual care teams, I think a natural progression of implementations happen as well. There's a question in the chat about KPIs for surgical units. I think some really easy KPIs for surgical units is discharge by noon metrics and how do you impact discharge by noon. I think admission metrics, like how quickly is admission documentation completed. That virtual nurse, when that patient lands post-surgery, that virtual nurse is on the post-surgical checklist. They're going through the admission, they're getting things done in an efficient way. That's another really easy metric to track. And then patient satisfaction, those surgical patients are super thrilled thrilled when they can walk out before noon in the hospital. I think those are very tangible ones to go for.
It's perfect.
I think also patient education from a surgical perspective too is a really good one. I see a lot of virtual nurses being brought in to do a more robust and spend that time with the education and then be able to kind of read it back per se, or give that back, and looking at the discharge education as well. I think that's another metric that you can look at. The care plans. How are we actually working through the care plans? Are we able to document on the care plans and show that the patient has understood what we're saying? And are there anything else that we need to focus on? The other piece I just wanted to add to what Sarah was talking about as well is, health systems, sometimes they try to do a plug and play model, that you build this one model for virtual nursing. We start on this unit and we go to each unit with that model. But I think in order to, we talked a lot about change management, you have to accept that there are nuances to different floors and respect that, and have those nurses have the ability to say, you know what, I really do think that this is how we're going to do it, but could we just try this little piece here differently for our unit? And then you monitor that, you see that, and then you adopt it that way. So I just wanted to make sure, I think that's important for a success of a virtual nurse program as well.
Yeah, I think that ability to be open to change is key. Go ahead, Kat.
I was gonna say, there's a couple questions in the chat that I wanted to make sure. They're kind of a little all over the place, but I promised we would be fluid and open to conversation. So the one question around assessing patient competency when you're giving some education virtually, like injections. My comment to that would be, and please y'all layer in here, you're not alone, right? You're not the only caregiver there just because you're the virtual nurse. If there's a patient competency issue, I would think that the standard would be reach back out to the bedside nurse that's there. If you have ever a question on a patient competency or any sort of virtual interaction, that's why that communication between bedside and remote clinicians is really important. Would you add anything to that, ladies on the panel?
Yeah, I think one thing, when you're implementing a program, it's important to have clear guardrails for communication. So, and you don't always want the virtual nurse to have to reach out to the bedside nurse and vice versa. You need to have the virtual nurse will always do this, except if they reach out. The bedside nurse will always be responsible for this, except if they reach out. Because the bedside nurse doesn't have time to be called by the virtual nurse over and over again, or have secure chat messages about what to do and how to do it. So let's say you're doing an admission discharge type program where the virtual nurse has all the admissions and all the discharges. Just have those clear operating lines. The virtual nurse will do the patient discharge unless they need some type of in-person education. And to your point, Kat, if it's assessment of a patient doing a skill that should have eyes and hands on, that's that one component of patient education that could be handed back to the bedside nurse. So it's really kind of that partnership, but agreeing on your lines and your order of operations early on so that you can't do that. When we started virtual nursing, this seems naive and ridiculous, but it was during COVID. So it was new. We thought, okay, we have expert nurses that are going to be in a command center. Who wouldn't reach out to them? And day one, it was crickets. Well, it's because nobody has time to reach out to them. And so quickly had to evolve to, okay, we need a set workflow, a set order of responsibilities that the virtual nurse will do to guide their day so that there's natural interaction that might happen in between them. And that really helps you be more efficient in how you're staffing and accomplishing care in partnership with the bedside team.
Yeah, Sarah, I love that you brought that up. I think it's absolutely key. And you need to know upfront, like, what are we going to do when the doctor comes? Or how are we going to handle these kinds of things? I've had folks talk about doing a check-in at the beginning of the shift between the virtual nurse and the bedside nurse. So they do a kind of rounding pre and post shift. And then they can sort of talk about, well, I've got this patient with the competencies. Would you start it? And I'll come in, or let me know how they're doing. And I think that works with the mentoring too. And on the other hand, I've heard patients say, I really love the fact that I can push a button and there's a virtual nurse and I don't have to bother my bedside nurse if I have a question about how to do something. So I think these are all like great points.
These are all great points, and they're kind of leading us into the future. There's one question out on the chat that I want to double down on around staffing and having a hard time staffing, actually. So any an unscripted question. So here we go. Any guidance or suggestions on how to go about staffing your virtual nurse program, especially those overnight staff positions?
Yeah, I think I feel your pain in trying to staff night shifts anywhere in nursing. When we were doing it at Mayo as well, like the night shift was awful and it was hard. So there's some strategies to help. One, do you have a flexible model in terms of staffing? So example, we had a mix of a centralized and a decentralized model, and a lot of places are moving to a decentralized model. Can you incentivize the night shift? If a nurse can do the night shift from their home and not have to drive to the medical center, to a command center to park and walk in, that is one way to kind of help boost people's willingness to do that. I think the other piece is, can you staff from different areas of the US? So not sure how large your health system is, but do you have time zone differences that you can take advantage of? Is it not really a night shift if you're in California versus if you're in New York, as an example? So we would take advantage of time zone differences, and they were more longer evening shifts for some rather than a true full overnight, or having your day shift come in, quote unquote early is another piece. I think people cringe sometimes when I say that you should be able to be a virtual nurse from home. That doesn't mean that you're sitting in your PJs, in a dark corner of the room taking a nap. We have to still be train our workforce on how to be. So an example is, do you have a common virtual background that your staff who are working virtual can do? We would have them wear a scrub top, just like they were going to the hospital. Again, they have to be in a well-lit room with a door. The expectation is that there's no tiny humans or animals or whatever, crawling around. And then the other, I think, important piece is tracking productivity. We want people to be successful, and it takes one person or individual, and they're everywhere. It's not just in virtual nursing, but it can really kill a program if you don't have the productivity you need. So making sure that you're tracking productivity metrics, and making sure you're having some follow-up with team members who might not be hitting targets. I think those are key to a decentralized model rather than a centralized model where everybody's kind of sitting in the same room.
I
Those are
think
just my
also
tips and tricks. Yeah, go ahead, Kristen.
Yeah, no, you hit the that staffing shortage, and often we're being called in from the Equum perspective because they can't find that staff and they don't have the ability. So we're sometimes they look outside of their own hospitals to have people come in to assist them, whether it's just for night shift, whether it's for day shift, or whether it's a 24/7 model, to be able to augment their staffing because they just can't. They're just not able to launch a program such like this. And I think that's when you can work with whomever that might be, as we do with other hospitals across the country, to really get into their workflows and get to know their teams and really augment what we need to, whether like I've referenced before, if it's admissions, if it's discharge, if it's mentoring, and how do you develop that program and what does that look like? We are the people behind the technology. Sometimes that's another option for systems as well to look at. And even if it's sometimes to have that as you build your own internal programs, sometimes programs outside of the hospitals can be used until you're ready. If it's like, if you're looking strategically on a 3 to 5 year program, this is something you want to do in the future. But until then, you really want somebody to help you define it, help you build it, put it into place, and then hand it off. So I've seen a lot of success in that as well.
It's perfect. All right. I want to talk a little bit about a virtual nurse workflow. Specific capabilities for the virtual nurse. So Sarah, you touched on it a little bit. Is there any more you would want to add to just the ideal experience for a virtual nurse workflow? There was a question in the chat about preparing the patient and the family on how to receive a virtual nurse workflow, or the components of the workflow that has a virtual nurse. Just any thoughts on that before we go a little bit deeper into that centralized versus decentralized model, like anything we want to kind of table set before we go deeper into what that workflow would be?
Yeah, just a couple of things. One, sometimes the early wins for a unit is different. So like where a surgical unit might love the admission discharge workflow for virtual nursing, and that's an immediately valuable experience. A medical unit might not have enough flow for that to be a highly valuable experience. And so making sure, the beauty of virtual nursing is it can be what you need it to be. So figure out the pain points, figure out the quick wins for staff on that unit. What don't you like to do? What can the virtual nurse do? But to Linda's point, we should focus on practice redesign through virtual nursing. So filling out those paper forms for quality, shifting that to the virtual nurse just to fill out a paper form or do a checklist. Do we need to do that? Let's talk about practice redesign before we just load everything onto the virtual nurse. And then our patients react to virtual nursing according to how their bedside care team feels. So if the bedside nurse walks in and is like, hey, I'm Sarah, I'm your nurse today, and I have this great colleague of mine, Kristen, she's going to be on the camera today. She's our virtual nurse. She's going to help me out. They're going to be like, great, this is fantastic. Counterpoint, if you walk in and you say, I'm Sarah, I'm going to be your nurse today, and we're doing this weird thing, it's called virtual nursing. I know it's on this camera, it's going to feel weird. That setup is important. So scripting the introduction is sometimes helpful for individuals. But having that on your radar that's just the number one indicator of patient experience and what they're going to feel.
Sarah, I'm so glad you said that, because that is key. I've seen that. And I think that, I've seen hospitals have buttons, ask me about my virtual nurse or our virtual program. I've seen welcome letters that actually introduce the virtual clinician so that they can see that as their welcoming packet. And I've actually had other clients that we do the welcome as the virtual nurse to their hospital, and we play videos for them. So, it's all how you introduce and how you accept it and how you bring it into your program. So I love that you shared that. I was snickering a little bit on the side, because we all know that culture that we have. And, like Linda said before, with virtual nursing, you're also adopting a new culture and changing culture, right? I mean, we all remember when the EHR was something new, when we were on paper for so long.
It's like
right?
CPOE.
Yeah. And here we go. We're going. This is the energy you've all heard about. Here we go. So, I think that look at the evolution of nursing and the care models as we redesign, and this is that next step and how we adopt that.
Yeah.
That's perfect. Let's keep going. So that's where we are. Where do we go next? Like what's in 1 year? What's in 5 years? Like how do you see that expanding, and what's next?
I'd love to talk a little bit about the care model redesign and the as Sarah started to talk about centralized versus decentralized, because I think it's really important, and then allow some time to talk about AI because it's super exciting. We talked about the importance of scale. We talked about that virtual nurse being the linchpin, and expanding those use cases. I had a member that actually started off in the ED because that's what the nurses wanted to do. But as we think about care model redesign, it really moves way beyond admission and discharge. The admission is a great place for that virtual nurse to start discharge planning on day one, becoming aligned with the patient. But then let's expand it to our rounding, not only our quality rounding, but our MDRs, our IDRs. And that virtual nurse becomes the glue that helps the patient move through the continuum. And then, as Sarah said, actually go to the ambulatory space, particularly when we think about like those surgical patients and the outcomes. But I do want to talk about centralized versus decentralized, because I think it's really, really important. One of the moves that I'm seeing, and I'd love to hear what the other folks think, is this move to a virtual care center. And that is where all virtual services come together under either a bunker or an offsite area. And not only do they come together, but they have an operating model, they have a chain of command, and then you get this beautiful economies of scale. And Sarah started to talk about it. I had one client who said, we really thought that people were just going to be talking over each other and nobody would want to be in a room with all these people. And then they said they absolutely loved it, because think about it. You've got your hospitalist, you've got your intensivist, you've got your EICU nurse that can, hey, take over some of those tasks and looking at those tele patients or people who are deteriorating. Even when you've got your tele staff and your virtual sitting staff, they can spot each other. You can expand those services. So you're getting economies of scale, not only in out in workflow, but you're getting it in technology. We just brushed across that, but how do you rationalize your technology so you don't have 20 different technologies, but 1 or 2 that are going to solve for that problem? And then finally, before I turn it over to my teammates, there is some power in the decentralized model. You build that trust up front, as Sarah talked about. But what I've seen is that folks quickly realize, we're going to start with that because we want people to feel okay and it's part of our culture, but we're really going to get that value in those economies of scale to move to decentralized. Sarah, Kristen, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I think decentralized key. I think we all figured out how to do virtual when COVID hit. I think our care teams can too. I think there's an important piece to burnout and reducing burnout. That doesn't mean that you don't have an option for people to come into. I also think there's, you have to have backup plans and redundancy and plans in place for if your power goes out at home, if you're facing a natural disaster, in those types of things, but those aren't insurmountable pieces to come over. So I would just say that don't feel like you have to have a centralized physical space for people to come to. Again, it's about getting started and speed to getting started, and sometimes decentralize is that. I think the future is in AI. So virtual care is helpful. It's helpful from a workforce. I think we realized that it's not going to make huge dividends on efficiency in how staff are interacting with patients or things like that. I think it's a different care model that's important. But as we talk about AI and the ability to automate or provide clinical decision support based on conversations that are happening, I think that is the future. And that's going to take virtual care, and that's going to take in-person care, and allow our clinical teams to get back to people. Over 50% of a clinician's time is spent in administrative tasks. When the EHR came, that computer was wedged right between the clinician and the patient. You're in a patient room today, they're on the computer looking and trying to do that. So I think AI is here and it's exciting. And over the next 5 years, I think we're going to see another boom of care redesign. And I hope that virtual care is everywhere. I know it's booming fast now, but I hope in 5 years we can say virtual care is everywhere and everybody has some type of virtual care program that's benefiting patients and staff.
Yeah, Sarah, I love it. We're seeing so much technology that is really supporting taking those redundant tasks off. Not only, decision support, which really is exciting when I'm using an old word with decision support, now it's AI, but really helping us understand, what is our next best thing that we need to do for this patient. And I just think it's so exciting to think about how we do that. And really, AI is thrown around. I don't know if you all remember, but when we started with Pop Health, that was thrown around. So how do we really understand, and this is a question for you, Sarah, what is really hype and what is really going to make a difference, and how do people cut through that when we talk about, because every website says somebody does AI.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So there's large language models. So there's different types of AI. AI is multimodal. It can look at a picture. There's other vended platforms out there where through a camera, it can determine if a patient's moving or if they've moved, or pressure injury detection. That's a visual component of AI. But then there's more large language model AI, where they can listen to a conversation that we're having and go through clinical decision support prompts to the clinician in the background. You think about, all too often right now, we have an experienced nurse give their, precepting skills to the next nurse, and every bit of experience on the unit is leaving right now. And so AI can fill in that experience gap in a very thoughtful way. There needs to be guardrails put in place. You can't just use ChatGPT and type in what to do, because there's not guardrails in place in those types of public platforms to be safe for patient care. But there's companies, coming up that can provide the safety guardrails and can integrate local policies and procedures to really be that kind of expert along for the ride, the companion. I also think it's dangerous to say that AI can replace any people. Healthcare is human. We can't, I don't think we can replace nurses with AI. And I would say that that's dangerous to even suggest, but AI can be a companion to our nursing care teams and an important companion in how they deliver care. And it's going to take nurses to inform that. Just like we're sitting here informing virtual nursing, we need nurses to inform what AI means to our profession moving forward, so that it's helpful.
Yeah, I don't think it's something. Yeah, I just think it's not something to be scared of, right? Like, I'm going to all these conferences now, and I'm sure you are, and everybody's like, AI, what does that mean? Oh my gosh, it's going to take over. And I think with people like all of us coming together to say, you know what, it can really enhance, and it can be an extension of these care teams that we're redefining at the moment. And then for organizations to really define what that looks like and have guidelines and have the nurses at the bedside and leadership as part of the discussion, so they're not fearful of it. It's just going to enhance their workflows, will be key to the success.
That makes sense. Absolutely. I'm reading some of the questions in the chat, and they're kind of along with what you're answering right now. So productivity and performance monitoring, as we're thinking about getting some of our virtual nurses home, like, You talked a lot about that, Linda. You guys all talked about like performance is key, productivity is key. Is there any?
Yeah, so
Mhm.
just some easy ways for productivity. I think there's softwares out there. So if you look, that you can find software that could probably do it at a minimal cost. But things to kind of track in terms of productivity is tracking how often are they on video. That's important.
Right.
Are they? I'm sorry, but you're not a virtual nurse if you're not on video in the room. You know, and we're not surveilling in the background. So are they interacting with patients? So tracking video time. I also think it's important to track their personal kind of metrics in terms of how many discharges are they getting done? How many admissions are they getting done? You know, you're going to have more productive nurses than others, and it's going to be important to kind of figure out who's doing it well and how can we use that as a model for training other people or getting them, you know, involved. Kristen, what are other KPIs, you know, for staff performance that you track?
Yeah, I think also how long does it take, right? Are there some people that are doing it in 20 minutes and there's other people that are doing it in 45? Well, then there's something to be said for that. Are we, you know, when you're on your implementation and you're defining an admission process, when you think about it, there's a lot that goes into an admission, right? You might be doing, you know, looking for pressure injuries. You might be doing fall risk assessments. Are they completing all of the aspects of what an admission was designed for? And what is that compliance to that? How many times are people reaching out from a mentoring perspective? You might see that sometimes when this person's on, they're getting all those calls and the other people aren't. Why is that? Tech town time. You know, I like to look at how many times did it not work for this person versus it worked for everybody else in time of day. You'd be surprised. So we always have to be on top of that. So those are some other key metrics to look for when you're looking for that. It's not just always about the speed, but the value that they're adding. And also, if we're doing those pulse surveys, really looking at the individual nurses to look at how they are being perceived by their colleagues and being able to have those conversations.
That's perfect. You know, you mentioned admissions, and there's a question in the chat. I just have to ask them. Opinions, thoughts on the nurse avatars, the AI nurse avatars that are conducting admissions. And this falls into the place of what you just said, Sarah. We can't replace humans, right? So what is that fine line? Does anyone have an opinion on that?
I just think it doesn't sit well with me that we can deduce our entire profession to like an AI avatar. Now, that doesn't mean that AI is not smart and frankly, it is smarter than me in a lot of things, right? But there is a component of being a nurse that is being the human connection that a patient has that AI can't be. Now, AI can be a companion, in my opinion, and there's plenty of things that an AI eventually, it's happening in customer service today. You often talk to an AI, right? You're talking to an AI on the other end to get customer support. Now, I'm usually saying operator, 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 so I can get to human because it's not where it needs to be yet. But there are plenty of interactions that, you know, we'll call it patient navigators, where an AI could be a patient navigator. I just don't like to confuse a nurse with an AI avatar. I don't think that that's where we should go, but that's just my personal opinion.
Great answer. It's a great answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important really quickly to go back to the definition of virtual nursing. And this goes back to EICU. And that is we're conducting the nursing process. We're using our nursing skills. We're just doing it through virtual technology. And that compassion, and Sarah, you talked a lot about it, and Kristen, in terms of who should be a virtual nurse, that comes through. And I don't think we can lose that. That's the beauty of all this.
That's a great way to end this session. I think this is really great conversation. I wish we had more time. I want to hear a story from everybody, but we have unfortunately hit the end of our hour. Thank you, audience, for your questions and helping facilitate the dialogue here. Thank you, panelists, for your thoughtful and fun interaction on the topic. I hope we get to do this again very soon.